Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the ELTcpd podcast. Today, we're talking about preparing students for Cambridge exams. I'm really excited to have teacher and materials writer Sangeeta with me. Hi, Sangeeta, how are
Hello.
you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for making the time and coming on.
It's
And
a pleasure.
thank you for listening to the episodes as well. I know you said you listened to
Yeah. No, I really like this podcast.
it. Thank you for the plug. So let's get started by hearing a little bit about you, your ELT background, experience with Cambridge exams.
Okay, so I started teaching in Spain, in Seville, in 2011,
Mhm.
and taught a range of different levels and ages. Then moved to Malaysia, taught there, back to Spain, and now I'm in the UK. So started off in language schools, and probably as with lots of teachers, was thrown in at the deep end with exam classes and kind of had to learn about the exam just before I was about to teach it, but taught kind of the like B1, B2, C1 Cambridge exams, the young learner suite of exams, starters, movers and flyers, and then later became a speaking examiner, and then in the last few years sort of started writing materials for Cambridge assessment, so teacher support materials, sort of writing guides, activity booklets, lesson plans,
Nice.
and that kind of thing. And then sort of 2 years ago became completely freelance. So now you'll see me online as English with Sangeeta. I teach my private students, make some courses, and then still do the writing
Nice.
for a range of different clients. Yeah.
Perfect. So I just want to touch on something you said about being thrown in the deep end with
Yeah.
exams. So was it something that once you started teaching, you just fell in love with? Like you just really enjoyed it, or?
I don't think I fell in love with it. I think that, exams, I think when you're first starting out, it's quite tricky because you're still getting to grips with sort of teaching the language and skills. And then you've got this extra layer, which is the sort of the exam strategy.
Mhm.
Um, but I think over time, like what I really like about teaching exams is there's a very clear focus and a very clear goal. And, students are generally quite motivated when they have to pass an exam. And so I think that it can be quite rewarding, and
Mhm.
I think both for the teacher and the learner. So yeah, I don't think it was love at first class, but it's
Yeah.
blossomed.
Yeah, I think a lot of teachers find themselves in those positions, right? Like
Yeah,
that's exactly how, like, I love assessment. Like it's my favorite thing. Same as you. It's black
yeah,
and white. There's a clear objective. There's a right and wrong answer to an extent, right?
yes, yeah,
But for me, it was in Spain. I think at the time I was teaching there became a new regulation where teachers had to achieve an FCE at the time, or first certificate.
right,
So then it became sort of the thing to teach because all teachers themselves needed it. Was that a similar situation for you? Do you find that that was the motivation for most of your students, or?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think this is what's really key when you're teaching, when you're preparing learners for exams, is thinking about what their motivation is.
Mhm.
And certainly in Spain, when I first started, there were, either teachers having to get it, and that level kind of got higher over the years. It started out being FCE as it was in those days, then it became C1 advanced that they needed.
Mhm.
Um, then there was that European regulation where, in order to get your degree, you had to have a B1 level.
Mm.
And so that was another motivation
Yeah.
for people doing these exams. And I think also in those days, there wasn't the same range of exams available. So the Cambridge exams were pretty much what everyone did,
Mhm.
certainly in Spain at that time. So there was, if you were going to teach, you needed to know how to
Mhm.
tackle the Cambridge exams, really.
Exactly. And you said you taught in Malaysia, so did you come across Cambridge exams there, or would you say that that's more of a European sort
No.
of focus?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't do any Cambridge exams. That they did exist. I know there were other schools that taught them, but that's when I moved into IELTS.
Okay.
and learned all about IELTS, which I also really, really kind of got to grips with and enjoyed. But then coming back to Europe, that was it's kind of interesting how each region has its preferred exam. Now I'm back in the UK, it's IELTS again. So
Really? Yeah, true, for visa and immigration
yeah,
purposes and things like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
And are the majority of your students at the moment UK based, or are they sort of where are
Th-
they?
They're in different places.
Mhm.
So I actually only have a handful of students. A lot of my time is spent writing.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I have a student in Germany, another one in Spain, another one in Ukraine.
Mhm.
So it depends.
Perfect. And so, when you were teaching and preparing your students for their Cambridge exams, let's think back to when you were first teaching and you were introduced to these Cambridge exams, right? Like,
Yeah.
did you find that the course materials you were using were sufficient, or did you find that over time you had to sort of supplement or find practice tests?
A bit of both. I think there are some great preparation materials out there, and I think if you're new to preparing learners for exams, like find a good course book um, because like it's full of just you know really amazing information about tips and strategies and all the rest of it. Um, Obviously, not every course book suits everyone or every group of learners, you know. Um, so I think you have to approach it in the same way you'd approach any class. It's
Mhm.
kind of like finding out about your learners and what their needs are, mining your course book or whatever it is that you're using for the most useful material,
Mhm.
and then supplementing as and when.
Exactly.
Um, like the Cambridge website is a great. It's very difficult to use because there's so much on it,
Mm.
but there's huge amounts of information there, like lesson plans, all kinds of support materials for the different levels. The handbook, I think, if if you're again new to exams or even not, like get to grips with the handbook. There's loads of tips in there and advice and things like that. So
Yeah, I think maybe with exam course books, it's a little bit different to general English course books, right? Because like you said, the strategies and the skills are sort of broken down and laid out, and there's a clear
yeah,
focus. Whereas with general English learning materials, obviously there's mixed abilities within any class, but that course assumes an ability of a CEFR level, let's say. Whereas exam preparation, you're working towards that level, right? So
yeah,
perhaps it's sort of easier to follow in a way. And like you said, the handbook's got lots of tips and stuff on there.
yeah.
Mm.
I mean, I still think in that situation, you may well be dealing with a range of levels within your class, though.
Mhm.
You may have a group of learners who all want this particular exam, but some are very close to that level and really need kind of the exam strategy
Yeah,
and a few bits of tips and advice. And there's others who really need skills development and language development to get them.
definitely.
So it can be quite challenging
Yeah, ex-
presented with 15 learners
of
at
course.
different stages.
Definitely. And how would you handle, I'm sure you've had this situation, as most teachers listening have, when you have a student who says, let's say, for example, I want to achieve B2, or yeah, let's say B2, um, but perhaps they're at sort of an A2 level and they've got a restricted time to learn it and they're like, I have to pass it. How do you tackle those
I
situations?
mean, that really depends on the context in which that learner's asking you. I think if it were a student coming to me and saying, "This is what I want," and I think I'd just be on like a private student.
Hmm.
I'd be honest about what was realistic
Hmm.
in the time frame. I think learners need to understand that generally to go up a level, that's going to take you, 80 hours of study or something.
Yeah,
Um, and that, that depends on every learner's different. Um, I think if you're in a school, it can be challenging because maybe there's commercial reasons why they may want to put a certain learner in a particular level.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, I don't know. I just think you have to be honest with learners about what's possible to achieve in a particular time frame.
Definitely. Or if not, it comes back on you as the teacher, right? Like, teacher, I was supposed to pass this and I
Yeah, yeah,
didn't.
yeah.
So what do you think are some key things for teachers to remember when they're preparing their students for Cambridge exams?
Okay, so get to know the exam.
Hmm.
I think you need to know the exam inside out and, uh, well, as best you can. Obviously it takes time to learn the exam inside out, but
Yeah.
try and understand the tricks and the pitfalls, the little traps that the exam sets for you,
Hmm.
um, and how you can help your learners with different strategies. Um, I think remember that different strategies work for different learners,
Hmm.
um, and I think what you need to do is show them options of how they can tackle different parts of the exam,
Hmm.
and then let them choose what works for them.
Hmm. By
What
that, do you mean sort of focusing on like the sub skills, or finding a way that works for them for an activity, like maybe planning before writing, not planning before writing, like
I think a bit of both. So I think helping your students understand, like I really believe in explaining to my students like why we do things in a particular way,
mm,
so that they understand why
mm,
I'm telling them to uh, scan the text first or
yeah.
skim read first, and that um, but also be prepared to accept that that might not work for them, even though the teaching manual says skim read first, then read for detail. It's not always right for everyone.
Hmm.
Um, I had an IELTS student who found reading in English incredibly easy because he did it a lot in his job and he read a lot of technical manuals, and he was just like, I can't, it doesn't work for me. I it's not the way my brain works.
Yeah.
This is the way I do it, and he was successful doing it that way. So I think you have to accept that, let people give your learners the different options, explain why, and then
Mhm.
let them choose what works best for them.
Yeah, that's a really good
Um,
point. And when you think about sort of thinking about that student that you said, obviously he used English in his work, right? So he used it in an authentic context anyway. There's debate about how authentic Cambridge exams are, or how authentic exam practice is, right? So thinking about, let's say, a part two of speaking where they have to describe an image. In the past, I've seen images with hands, and it's like, what are people using their hands for in these photos? And you think, when have I ever spoken about that in my life? So
yeah, yeah,
how
yeah.
do you sort of contextualize the exam for students when it's not necessarily the way that they would use language outside of the classroom?
So I kind of think, exams, they're perhaps a necessary evil. It's this construct which tests your ability in a very particular and hopefully rigorous way.
Mhm.
And like you say, that means that sometimes, often, it's not particularly authentic. So I think, coming back to what I said before about kind of making it relevant to your students is thinking about how they will use what they're learning in an authentic way,
Mhm.
or how it's going to be relevant to their lives
Mhm.
outside the context of the exam,
Yeah.
um, and whether that's particular types of language or structures or sub skills that you're teaching them. I think that's probably the most important thing, is
Mhm.
kind of what's beyond the exam,
Yeah.
um, and kind of finding ways to get them to see how this will be useful in another way. Because let's take maybe not part two, but say part three. Okay, the task itself is it's very inauthentic.
Mhm.
Um, but the skills that they're learning, like that turn taking or having to clarify what their partner says, all of that is kind of real, you know, authentic discourse in a different context.
Yeah, true.
Um,
True.
so I guess helping them to see that and use those tools in other tasks as well.
Mhm. Definitely. Just for anyone listening who doesn't know about the different parts of the exam, part three is no, it's okay. It's that there might be teachers listening who think, oh, I don't know. So yeah, I think it's just when you have the different. Maybe you can explain it better than I
Okay.
can.
So, it depends on which exam it is, but across the Cambridge exams, so for B1, B2, and C1, certainly, it's called the collaborative task. So students have to talk about a range of options. The actual task is slightly different in each exam, but it's a discussion, and they kind of have to come to an agreement,
Hmm.
or try to come to an agreement
Hmm.
by the end of the task.
Perfect.
Um,
And how do you feel that obviously nerves play a huge part, but have you ever had an experience where your student maybe feels quite confident in their preparation and going into it, and then that just doesn't reflect in their results because their nerves have got the better of them or something like that?
I mean, I think it's hard to say what impacts on a student's results, and whether it was nerves or a poor performance, or anything else that could happen on the day.
Hmm.
Um, but I think, it's not always possible, but generally, I sort of only recommend students put themselves forward when they're kind of reaching a particular level, a comfortable level,
Hmm.
um, whether that's in reading, writing, speaking, listening, because I think you have to allow that on the day, things can go wrong. You just don't feel great, or you feel nervous, or the topic is, you know, difficult, and you can't think of anything to say or write.
Hmm.
Um, so, yeah, I think kind of, if you can, make sure your students are comfortably getting passing grades before they sit the exam, and that allows for those, you know, issues on the day.
And would you do that by sort of giving practice tests in the lead up to the exam, or
Yeah.
how often would you advise giving practice tests?
Oh, that's tricky. I think that you need to use practice tasks. I mean, throughout the exam preparation. But in terms of kind of doing exam style, full exams, you don't really want to do that until really close to the day. I think you can get a lot of practice without having to sit for an hour and a half and do an exam. I think with the speaking, though, you need to do a lot of kind of exam style, so that they get used to the timing, and they understand, for example, in part two, they have to speak for a minute, so they really feel that they know what a minute is like without the timer. Um, and I think you can make that a bit more, if you've got a group of students, you can make that more fun by having one person as the examiner, and, kind of turn that into a bit of a role play, um, so that they get used to what that exam situation feels like.
Definitely,
Uh,
because a minute is actually quite a long time, isn't it, when there's
yeah,
silence and someone's expecting you to say something.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and you mentioned there, obviously, students acting as the examiner and doing the speaking test among themselves. I think a major issue for teachers is that obviously there's only one of them, and perhaps if they're teaching a group of students, how can you ensure that you're getting students that speaking practice when perhaps they would want to speak with you, but there's just not enough hours allocated?
I mean, I think that's also a kind of common consideration in any class, that, teachers, students can't always expect to speak to the teacher. They have to, get their practice with other learners. Um, but I think, um, kind of, uh, helping your students understand what the assessment criteria are, I think, is really key. Um, Now, they don't have to have the same understanding of the assessment criteria as the examiners, obviously. But if they understand what they're assessed on, then they can sort of do a little bit of that assessment with their peers, right?
Mhm.
You can have checklists where, they're listening for certain things, whether that's about the format of the exam, or particular language or sub skills. Um, so I think, kind of, what's the best way to say this? But sort of let them in on the secret of what they're being tested on,
Yeah.
and that has real benefits for the person kind of giving that feedback, and also for the person receiving it.
Definitely.
Um, they've done studies that show that often learners receive feedback from their peers in a different and more effective way than they do from a teacher.
Hmm.
And learners can be really good at giving feedback if you help them and train them. I think they can be really effective.
Definitely. Yeah, and maybe it's easier to take feedback on board from someone who's sort of at your level, right? Rather than, because obviously teachers have different perspectives of authority in different countries, right? So getting told, not that you're doing something wrong, but that you could do something in a different way might be perceived differently than if a peer was telling them, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So do you think it's helpful then to introduce students to the marking criteria? I mean, I'm a big advocate for that, but what's your thoughts?
No, definitely, absolutely. One of particularly with the speaking and the writing, one of the things that I always see is that learners assume that the most important thing is vocabulary and grammar, accuracy, and maybe pronunciation in the speaking, and not much else. And I think once you show them that that's actually just like maybe 25 or 20% of their mark, and there's all these other things that they're being assessed on, I think that can be quite motivating, because it's like, oh yeah, I can do that. And often those areas can actually be easier to improve more quickly than perhaps kind of upping their grammatical level. So I think it's important that learners know what they're being assessed on,
Definitely.
and try and explain it in terms they can understand.
Hmm.
Um, there is actually, there's guides to all of these things on the Cambridge website. I'm not being paid by Cambridge, but which I think they're intended for teachers, but they help you to think about how you can explain that assessment process
Hmm.
to
Exactly.
your learners.
And as a speaking examiner, you have quite a unique perspective because you obviously taught or teach students, you write the materials, and you sort of speaking examine. So, what do you notice in the speaking exam? I know this is quite student dependent, but just thinking about sort of the how the students perform in those exams, is there anything that you think specifically for speaking that teachers could perhaps do with their students just to push them a little bit more and just to help them achieve sort of a better grade in speaking, perhaps?
Oh gosh,
Or
that's quite a
anything you've
big
noticed as
question.
as a speaking examiner that's sort of stuck out to you.
um, So I think one of the things maybe is, it's great when, like, and I think it's really important that you teach your learners a kind of framework to work in. That can be really helpful. But I think that mm, sometimes that framework can become very robotic.
Oh, interesting. Okay. That's a good point.
Yeah, and so it can be interesting when you kind of see that same um, framework over and over again. Um,
Yes.
so yeah, just perhaps be careful of how much you're drilling students in kind of speak in this. Obviously we say don't memorize answers, don't learn, and I think if you're teaching your students to kind of, these are exactly the things you need to say, let's repeat it 25 times until it's, yeah,
I
it's
mean,
not the most
sometimes you can tell your
useful.
students not to remember and repeat things, and then they'll do it anyway because they think it's useful. I probably would do the same if I was taking a language
I
test.
mean, sometimes I'm really impressed that like these students are so well drilled. I'm like, wow, I wish I could get them to remember this. But
Exactly, exactly. So thinking about sort of exam preparation classes, what are some activities or ways of making exam prep fun rather than just sort of a heads down task approach?
yeah, so I think anything that's in your armory that makes your usual classes more dynamic and engaging, you can apply that to an exam class. I And in the same way, I think it's really important not to sort of make them fun for fun's sake. Like,
Mhm.
if we're playing a game, like, what are we actually learning from this game, or are we just doing it because it's fun? And maybe I'm really boring, but I think I come back to this idea that I think if you make what they're learning relevant and authentic and, useful to them, I kind of think that's where the challenge and the enjoyment really comes from.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I think, anything that you normally do that makes your lessons more interactive, more dynamic. Like, for example, getting learners to create their own exam materials.
Mhm.
Like, it's brilliant because it helps them to understand how the
Mhm.
different tasks are put together. Like, it can be a fun activity for them. Um, and also, if you use, get your learners to bring in photographs to turn into part 2 speaking tasks, and then, other learners in the class do those activities. It doesn't matter if the photos are a bit silly. It just makes the whole thing a bit more memorable, as long
Yeah.
as they're doing the same style of task and doing the things that you need them to do in the exam, but with some, photos of their classmates.
Yeah, that's true. That's really nice actually, because like you said, that makes it more authentic, right? More personalized and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
anything
really nice.
that can personalize it, I think,
Mhm.
while still thinking about, uh, the kind of the sub skills and the particular aim of the
Mhm.
different tasks that they need to do.
That's really nice. Something I did with students, obviously, this is space dependent, but the language school I taught in, we had sort of a computer lab and stuff that we could use as well, was do like a stations task. So have like one station with reading, one station
Yeah,
with writing. If you only want to practice receptive skills, you could just do it like that and then get them to move around. And I think the other thing is not getting students to have to do a full writing all the time, right? Because if I think about how many essays I've written in my life, I could count them on one hand.
yeah,
I
yeah,
know
yeah,
that's
yeah.
the point of some of the writing tasks, but sometimes just writing a perfect introduction, really honing that introduction could be more
No, I think I
important.
think that's I think that's really key, and I think that's really key in every part of the exam. It's, um, if you're unfortunately, it's often what students want is that more exam practice, again, 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 and actually, it's much more beneficial to break it down
Yeah.
and, like you say, let's think about how we can create a brilliant introduction, and maybe that's
Mhm.
all you do. And
Mhm.
what is it that makes a good introduction? What language do we need to use? Um, you know, what is, how can we think about turn taking
Mhm.
in a different task or a different context,
Exactly.
um, rather than just doing full exam tasks
Exactly.
over and over again.
Yeah.
Um,
And what about activities for skill building? Oh, that was difficult to say, skill building. So rather than just focusing on like the exam tasks, I know you mentioned sort of skimming and scanning earlier. Do you have any particular activities that you like to use?
so I think, with exam preparation, you're always thinking about kind of general skills development, skills and language development
Mhm.
alongside exam strategy.
Mhm.
Um, and I think I feel like we have certain tendencies with particular skills. Like, I think in writing, the tendency can be to look at the sort of the micro and focus on like spelling and grammar and vocabulary and mistakes, and not look at the bigger picture.
Mhm.
So thinking about activities that look at organization or content or coherence, like things like group writing tasks can be good for this. So where they plan an essay, to kind of link it back what you were saying about just writing an introduction, plan a writing task together, and then each learner writes a paragraph, and then they put it back together and they see how well does that work? Did How effective was our plan? Does
Yeah.
our essay or article make sense? And do these paragraphs link together? It helps them think about organization and coherence and all of these other things,
Mhm.
and not just, how much red pen is there on my, or another thing that's kind of more general skills. So with listening, I think that there's a tendency to focus on big picture, like meaning, general understanding of listening texts, and not think about the micro. And so, like dictation activities where, and you can use exam listening texts for this. Just play like 20 seconds or 30 seconds and get students to write down everything they hear, and then look at what they've heard, and again analyze, like, what caused the problems. Was it connected speech? Was it unknown vocabulary? Like, so yeah, kind of thinking about big and micro and macro, or
Yeah.
big picture and
Yeah.
detail.
So maybe sort of more evaluation and critical analyses of tasks rather than this is what I've produced. What grade would you give it, right?
Exactly, and kind of thinking about the process of that rather than just making finished products, whether they're, like finished product would be, doing a complete listening. What else can we get out of this
Yeah. Yeah.
listening text, and mining, any exam practice tasks in other ways, like looking at a listening transcript and mining it for vocabulary or phrases, or I don't know, getting your students to create keyword transformations out of the listening text or something. Just think about how all these things work together, and get the most out of all the
Yeah,
material.
I think that's really important what you said, focusing on the process rather than the product, right? Like that's crucial, and getting students to understand that I think is important as well, because they, like you said, they might be like, "Where's my practice test? Why am I not doing this?" Whereas there might be a whole lesson build up just to write one conclusion or one introduction
Yeah,
or something. So I think listening is quite interesting that you mentioned, because I don't know about you, but I always feel that students judge their listening based on how many answers they got correct, right?
exactly.
Especially with multiple choices. They're like,
Yeah.
did I get that correct? Yes or no? So how do you remedy the got that feedback, how do you then get students to want to analyze and not just focus on their scores?
I mean, I actually think like the most useful part of any kind of comprehension task or exam task like that is actually what you got wrong.
Mm,
The ones you got right, okay, brilliant, fine.
yeah.
And it can be difficult to get students on board. I've had students in the past kind of say, "Oh, we spend so much time analyzing our answers," but that's where the gold is. That's where the useful information is. And I think if you can help them to understand why things are right and why they're wrong, that gives them